The prairie still smelled of smoke when the wind came crawling back from the mountains. Ash rode the air in slow spirals, settling into the grass roots and the seams of charred earth like black snow. To the east, the ridgeline was no longer ridgeline at all, just a wavering mirage of soot and ruin under a sky the color of tarnished copper. The world had burned clean. Elias Carter stood alone at the edge of what used to be his neighbor's homestead. The timbers lay fused into the ground, warped and twisted. The wind hissed through them, low and mournful. It was the sound of the prairie remembering. He shifted his weight, feeling the crunch of cinders beneath his moccasins. His coat, once buffalo hide, now gone the color of earth, hung loose against his frame. His beard was streaked with dust. To a stranger, he might have looked like a man risen from the ground itself, one of the old ones who had never left. But there were no strangers out here anymore. Only survivors. He looked back toward the hill where his own home lay, a low hump of earth and grass, smoke-stained but standing. From a distance, it might have been mistaken for a badger's den or an overgrown mound. That was the point. The prairie had taken everything it could reach with the fire, but it hadn't touched the place beneath. Weeks earlier, when the wind had turned dry and the grass crackled underfoot, the settlers had laughed at him. Mole Carter, they'd called him, the man who dug instead of built. When they hammered their cabins upright, the sound carried across the flats like pride made solid. Elias had worked in silence, his shovel biting into the clay bank near the creek. He had carved his home into the slope, a dugout, the kind he'd seen the crow use when the winters pressed hard and the buffalo herds ran lean. The walls were timbered with pine logs scavenged from the foothills, the roof cross-hatched with poles, sod, and a thick plaster of clay mixed with river silt. It smelled of damp earth and smoke, and when he slept there, the world above felt distant, like a dream that had finally stopped shouting. The others said it was foolishness, the sort of thing a man does when he's forgotten how to live among people. But Elias knew better. He'd spent too many winters in the high country to trust open walls and clean air. The wilderness had its moods, and fire was one of them. Back in the days when the beaver trade was king, he'd learned to read the moods of the land the way a man reads a face. A shift in the wind, a certain smell in the pines, the restless silence before a storm, all were signs. The mountains had taught him that survival was not a matter of strength, but of listening. He could still remember the last rendezvous he'd ridden to 4 years earlier on the upper green. The trappers came from every direction, Jim Bridger with his wolf grin, the half-breed Beckworth laughing louder than the whiskey fire, and a dozen more who had once been names in stories and were now just men without buyers for their pelts. The talk that year was grim. Felt hats were out of fashion in London. The beaver had been trapped near to extinction along the Missouri. The companies were folding, their traders pulling back to St. Louis. That was the summer Elias decided the old life was finished. A man could chase rivers only so long before they led him in circles. He sold his traps, kept his rifle, and drifted east until he reached the edge of the plains. The Laramie country was open, then wind, grass, and sky without end. There were a few settlers, mostly families too stubborn or too poor to keep heading for Oregon. They talked of crops, of churches and fences. Elias talked little at all. He built where the ground curved like a cupped hand, a place hidden from the worst of the wind. He dug down, each shovelful a prayer to the old life, quiet, methodical, certain. When the walls took shape, he lined them with willow branches to hold the clay in place, and he set a small hearth of river stone at the far end. His door was a plank stolen from a broken wagon, his chimney a hole capped with a slab of slate. When he lit his first fire inside, the smoke curled upward and vanished clean into the earth above. By autumn, he was done. He had a home the color of the land, the shape of a memory. The settlers came by out of curiosity. "Ain't no man supposed to live like a gopher," one of them said, leaning on his shovel. Another spat and asked if he was expecting a siege. Elias only smiled. "Maybe," he said, "but I aim to be ready for whatever comes." That was enough to make him a joke at the next barn raising. They said he slept with the snakes, that he was part Indian, part ghost. None of it troubled him. The prairie had never been kind to men who needed company. He lived by his hands, grew corn in the creek bed, kept a pair of goats, hunted antelope when the herds came down from the foothills. In the evenings, he sat outside his mound house and watched the sky change colors until the stars came out. Some nights, he thought he could still hear the wild geese he used to follow north, their calls echoing over the Wind River Range. The world beyond the horizon was changing. The Oregon Trail had begun to carry families westward, long wagon trains winding past Fort Laramie. He watched them from a distance, children waving, oxen bawling, women in bonnets staring out at the endless sea of grass. They were chasing a promise. Elias had already caught his. Yet even he could sense that something was coming. The summer had been too dry. The wind blew steady from the south, smelling of resin and dust. The buffalo trails cut through the tall grass like warning scars. He saw smoke once, far off beyond the ridge, and it set an old unease stirring in him, the kind that trappers used to call the whisper of the fire god. He started storing water then, tamping the roof tighter, spreading wet clay over the sod. When his neighbors saw him working, they called across the field, "Mole Carter's at it again." He didn't answer. He just kept listening to the wind, to the silence, to the old instincts that had never lied to him. Now, standing in the aftermath, he could still hear that silence. The prairie stretched away in all directions, stripped bare, every stalk burned to a shadow. His dugout was blackened around the chimney, but inside it was cool and safe. The fire had passed over him like a judgment that had found no guilt. He turned his face toward the west. The Laramie Mountains were smudged with smoke, their peaks hidden behind a veil of haze. Somewhere beyond them, the snowmelt stream still ran clear. Somewhere, the world was green. Elias Carter drew a long breath and exhaled the dust. The others would rebuild if they returned. They would build higher, stronger, prouder. But he would stay beneath the earth, where the wind could not find him, where the lessons of the old wilderness still held. He was not the first man to dig downward for safety, nor would he be the last. The mountain men had learned long ago that the land gives back what it takes if a man listens hard enough. And Elias Carter had spent a lifetime listening. Before the fire, before the laughter and the loneliness, there had been a time when Elias Carter's name meant something among the fur men of the high country. They called him Silent Eli back then, a man who spoke only when the mountains required it. He'd come west in his youth, chasing the promise of silver water and thick-furred beaver, back when the trade was the pulse of an empire few men east of the Mississippi could imagine. The summer of 1838 was his last great journey before the quiet years. The Green River Rendezvous that year drew them all, Bridger, Fitzpatrick, the Sublette brothers, and scores of trappers from the American and Rocky Mountain companies. The basin below the Wind River Mountains was alive with canvas tents, wagons, and the glitter of trade goods under a sun that seemed carved from brass. For a week, the wilderness itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with them. There were whoops of Shoshone horsemen riding through camp, the sound of hammers on flintlocks, and the smell of burning willow bark mixed with whiskey and sweat. Elias remembered it all as if it were branded into his memory, the shouting, the laughter, the raw energy of men who had lived too long without walls. But beneath it all, something had changed. The traders spoke in low voices of markets gone sour. In street, "Louis," they said, the warehouses were full, the London hatters had turned to silk, and the beaver was no longer worth the blood it cost to trap. There was talk that this might be the last great rendezvous. Elias had sat by the fire with Jim Bridger one night, both of them working the grease from their fingers after a meal of boiled elk. Bridger spat into the flames. "Ain't no living in fur no more," he said. "The rivers are trapped clean, and the company men don't give a damn about the old breed." Elias nodded, quiet as ever. He wasn't one for speeches, but he felt the truth of it down to his bones. The world that had made them was closing like a bear trap. James Beckworth rode in the next day with a band of Crow, wearing beads and feathers that caught the light like embers. He had stories, as always wild tales of battles and women, of riches found and lost. "The mountains will always take care of their own," Beckworth said, grinning through his beard. You just got to know how to listen to them. Those words stayed with Elias longer than he realized. When the trading ended, he packed his traps carefully, oiled his hawk and rifle, and rode north toward the Bighorn. The streams ran low that year, their beds cluttered with silt instead of pelts. The sound of the beaver tail slapping water was gone. Even the smell of fresh hides had faded from campfires. At night, he'd lie awake, listening to the wind sweeping through the pines. Once, it had sounded like freedom. Now, it sounded like an ending. He wintered that year with a small band of Crow along the Powder River, sharing their lodges and their meat. They taught him things the white traders never cared to learn: the way to shape clay and willow into walls that could hold against a blizzard, the art of sealing smoke holes against wind, the patience to survive by making oneself small before the storm. It was there, in a pit house half buried in snow, that Elias learned the craft of the earth. The Crow called such dwellings apapashi, houses of the belly. They were warm, silent, and nearly invisible from the plains. "The wind forgets you down here," one of the elders told him. "And what the wind forgets, the fire cannot find." When spring came, he followed the melting rivers south again. He passed through the ruins of old trapping grounds, broken cabins, rusted traps, and graves marked only by sticks. The trade was dead. The mountains were emptying. Men who had once risked everything for a pelt were heading east to become farmers or drunkards. Elias kept going, not knowing what he was looking for. By the time he reached the Laramie Plains, his horse was lean and his mind quiet. The land there rolled gentle and wide, a place that neither river nor mountain claimed entirely. It felt like a middle ground somewhere between the wild and whatever came after it. He camped for a month along the creek, watching antelope graze among the sage. When the wind blew at night, it carried the smell of earth, not pine or rot. That was when the idea first took root to dig downward, to make a home that the wilderness would recognize as one of its own. Years later, when the settlers mocked his buried house, Elias never tried to explain. How could he tell them that it wasn't madness, but memory, that the shape of his home came from the wisdom of people who had lived through 1,000 winters, from the silence of the Crow lodges and the bones of the old fur camps? He simply kept digging, as if every stroke of the shovel was a way of staying faithful to a world the rest of them had already forgotten. That last rendezvous had ended the age of mountain men, but it had given Elias something better than trade or fame. It had given him the knowledge that a man doesn't conquer the wilderness, he learns how to live inside it. And though the world would soon burn, that lesson would keep him alive when all else turned to ash. The prairie had gone strange that year. By June, the grass stood brittle and tall, dry as parchment. When the wind swept down from the Medicine Bow Range, it carried the faint smell of resin and dust, like a warning whispered through the sage. Every morning, Elias Carter would step from his earthen door and taste the air the way a man might test the edge of a blade. Something in it had changed. The settlers didn't see it. They were too busy building, planting, hammering their futures into the ground. Cabins rose one after another along the creek, their log walls glowing golden under the sun. The Whitlocks, John and Sarah, had finished theirs in May, and they were proud of it. A square, tight home with a shingled roof, whitewashed trim, and curtains Sarah had sewn from old feed sacks. When Elias passed their place on his way to the river, Sarah would wave from her porch. "You come to dinner sometime, Mr. Carter," she'd say, smiling like the world wasn't made to break things. He'd tip his hat and murmur something polite. He liked her kindness, but he didn't belong to their kind of life. Her husband, John, was less gentle. "You still sleep in that hole?" he'd call across the fence. "Ain't no shame in building up like a man instead of digging down like a badger." Elias had smiled then, too, slow and quiet. "Wind don't find me easy down there," he'd said, "nor the cold." The younger men, farmhands, drifters, a blacksmith named Tom Kearney, laughed at that. "Hell, wind's part of living," Kearney said, hammering a nail into the frame of his forge. "You can't hide from the sky forever." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sky had already told him what was coming. He'd seen prairie fires before, once near the Platte, when he was still trapping with the old brigade. He remembered how the horizon had turned red without a sound, then roared like a living thing. The grass had gone up faster than a horse could gallop. The flames rolled with the wind, leaping coulees and dry creek beds as if they had wings. Men had died trying to outrun them. That memory followed him now, shadowing every sunrise. By July, the air grew brittle enough to snap. The settlers talked of rain that never came. The cattle pawed at dust where grass used to be. Even the creek behind Elias's dugout had slowed to a trickle, the water tasting like warm metal. He started preparing, quietly, carefully. He sealed the roof with another layer of clay and sod, packed the doorway with damp earth, and buried his water barrels halfway underground to keep them cool. Inside he laid his supplies in order: dried corn, jerky, tools, and his old powder horn. It wasn't fear that moved him, it was habit, the same instinct that had kept him alive through a dozen winters in the mountains. When Tom Kearney stopped by one evening, wiping sweat from his face, he found Elias working at the chimney vent. "Still patching that burrow of yours?" Tom said, shaking his head. "You'll smother yourself in there one day." Elias leaned on his spade. "Better smothered than burned," he said simply. Tom frowned. "You thinkin' the wind'll turn bad?" Elias didn't look up. "Ain't the wind. It's the grass." That night, thunder rolled across the plains, no rain, just lightning, dry and sharp as flint strikes. Elias watched from his doorway as blue forks split the horizon. One struck far off to the north, so faint he almost missed it. For a moment the prairie glowed, then went dark again. He stood there until the wind changed and the smell came smoke. Thin at first, then steady. By dawn, the northern sky had a strange, dull glow, and a haze hung low over the land. The settlers gathered near the Whitlock's barn, shading their eyes against the light. "Probably just a grass burn from them hunters," someone said. "Nothing to fret," John Whitlock added, puffing out his chest. "Fire never crosses the flats this far south." Elias said nothing. He just turned toward the ridge and squinted. The glow was stronger now, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of something alive. The next days were restless. Smoke came and went, depending on the wind. Cattle bawled through the night. Birds vanished. The sun rose red and set darker still. By the third day, ash began to fall, tiny flakes, gray as snow, clinging to shirts and wagon wheels. Sarah Whitlock came to Elias's dugout that evening, her apron streaked with dust. "Is it close?" she asked. Elias looked at the horizon. "Closer than they think." She bit her lip. "John says it'll turn. The wind always turns." "Sometimes," Elias said. "Sometimes it don't." He offered her a bucket of water before she left. She hesitated, then took it. Her hands were shaking. That night, he slept lightly, one ear tuned to the world above. Just before dawn, he felt it, the tremor of the wind shifting, the faint hum of something moving fast through the grass. When he climbed to the ridge, the horizon to the north was a solid wall of fire. The prairie had become a sea of flame, rolling south under a wind that screamed like it had a purpose. The settlers hadn't seen it yet. They would, soon enough. Elias went back down to his dugout, sealing the entrance tight. The air inside was cool and heavy, smelling of damp clay and smoke. He sat by his hearth, listening to the far-off roar, growing louder, closer, alive. Outside, the prairie wind howled through the valley. The fire had begun its march. And Elias Carter, the man they'd mocked as a mole, was ready. When the sun rose that morning, the light was wrong, too red, too sharp. The wind came early, heavy with the dry hiss of burning sage far away. Elias Carter stood on the rise above his dugout, his hair whipped by the gusts, and knew the world was about to turn cruel again. He'd felt this before. Not on the plains, but high in the Wind River country, years ago, when winter had crept down from the ridges without warning. He and two others, old hands from the brigade, had been caught above timberline, with nothing but rawhide tents and a mule half-starved from snow blindness. The cold had come like a predator, silent until it struck. The fire they built that night burned blue and small. just enough to remind them how fragile warmth really was. Only one of the three saw spring again. That was when Elias learned nature never punished, it simply didn't care. You either listened or you vanished. Now, years later, he could feel that same truth in the wind. The prairie was holding its breath. Down along the creek, the settlers were working like it was any other day. John Whitlock was mending a fence rail, shirt stripped to the waist, his hammer ringing through the stillness. Sarah carried water from the well. The blacksmith, Tom Kearney, was at his forge, sparks flying bright against the smoke-hazed air. They saw the haze, but didn't understand it. To them, it was weather. To Elias, it was omen. He walked down from his mound house carrying 2 water skins and a rolled hide. Sarah spotted him first. "Mr. Carter," she called, "you look fit to travel heading out?" Elias stopped by the fence and rested one hand on the post. "Not travelin'. Preparing." John looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Preparing for what?" Elias tilted his head toward the northern ridge. The sky there was the color of dried blood. "For what's already on its way." John chuckled, though the sound came uneasy. "You think that fire's going to reach us? It's a good 20 miles off." Elias met his gaze. "So's a storm until the wind changes." That silenced him for a moment. Even Tom Kearney paused his hammering. But then pride reasserted itself, the stubborn kind that had driven men west to carve homes from a wild they barely understood. "You worry too much, Mole Carter," John said, forcing a grin. "This ain't the mountains. Fire won't climb through open prairie." Elias's eyes narrowed. "It don't climb," he said softly. "It runs." When he returned to his dugout, the air behind him already shimmered with heat. He spent the next hours sealing his door. The design he used was one he'd learned long ago from the crow, a method born from snowstorms, not fire, but no less sound. Layers of wet clay pressed into the timber seams, a hide curtain hung behind the door to trap what air remained cool. He doused the sod roof again and again until it bled mud down the walls. Inside, the air grew thick and dim. He worked by touch, moving tools to where he could reach them easily. His rifle leaned against the wall, though he doubted it would help against what was coming. Outside, the wind had changed tone. It had a pulse now, a rhythmic gusting that carried a low roar far in the distance. When the first settlers rode up shouting, he stepped out into the daylight one last time. Tom Kearney's horse was lathered in sweat. "Fire jumped the creek," he yelled. "Comin' fast, Eli, real fast." Elias could already see it, a faint flicker along the horizon, like the earth itself had caught fever. "You tell the others to move south," he said. "Ride hard, ride light, don't stop for wagons." "What about you?" Tom shouted over the wind. Elias looked toward his mound, smoke swirling like ghosts above it. "I'm stayin'." Tom stared, disbelieving. "You'll die in there." Elias almost smiled. "Maybe, but I've lived through worse." He offered Tom a skin of water. "Go on," he said, "and take whoever you find." The blacksmith hesitated only a moment longer before spurring his horse into the haze. When Elias turned back toward the valley, the fire had already begun its march. The wind came hot and fast, carrying bits of burning grass that drifted through the air like sparks of some great forge. The sound reached him low at first, then growing, until it filled the sky. It wasn't the crackle of flame he remembered from campfires. It was a roar, deep and constant, like the breath of a living beast. He ducked inside, closing the door and pressing the hide curtain tight. The light vanished. His world became small earth walls, the faint glow of his hearth, and the rhythmic pounding of his own heart. He wet a rag and tied it across his face. The air inside grew hotter, heavier. He could feel the fire above him now, moving across the sod roof, drawing the oxygen from the ground. In the dark, his mind slipped backward again to another fire. Years ago, on the banks of the Yellowstone. His campmate, Joseph Crane, had tried to smoke beaver fat in a bark hut, and the thing went up like gunpowder. Elias had dragged him out through the flames, hands blistered to the bone. When they'd stumbled into the river, Crane had laughed through the pain. "Guess we learned something, Eli," he'd said. "Fire don't care about reason." Now, crouched in his earthen home, Elias whispered the same words to himself. "Fire don't care about reason." He closed his eyes and waited. The roar grew to a scream. The ground itself seemed to tremble. Ash and heat pressed against the door until it creaked and smoked, but the clay held. Inside, the air turned thick and metallic, but it did not burn. Time stretched. Minutes became hours. The world outside ceased to exist. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the roar faded. The silence that followed was absolute, deep enough to make his ears ring. He waited another long while before unlatching the door. When he finally pushed it open, a gust of cold air met him. The prairie was gone. The horizon lay flattened and black, the grass turned to ash, the air still shimmering with heat. His dugout stood half covered in soot, but whole. Not a spark had caught the roof. Around him, everything else had been erased. Elias stepped out slowly, his boots sinking into warm cinder. He looked toward the creek. No cabins, no fences, only smoke. The sky above was dark and strange, a twilight at noon. For a long moment, he didn't move. The world had burned itself clean, but he was still there alive beneath the memory of flame. And deep down, in that quiet core of his mountain man's soul, Elias Carter understood. The wilderness had tested him again, and once more he had listened well enough to survive. The wind had become a weapon. It screamed across the open land, driving the flames before it like a cavalry charge. The prairie itself seemed to move a living wall of orange and red that devoured everything in its path. From the ridge above the creek, Elias Carter watched it come. The horizon was gone, swallowed in smoke. The air shimmered with heat so fierce that the world wavered like water. He could smell it now, not just grass and sage, but the deeper, darker scent of burning wood, tar, flesh. Below him, chaos. Settlers ran between cabins, shouting. Livestock broke their pens and scattered into the open fields. The Whitlock's wagon stood half-loaded, their horses screaming as John fought to harness them. Sparks rained from the sky like a storm of stars turned wicked. Elias cupped his hands and bellowed through the gale, his voice barely carrying, "Leave the wagons, get to the creek." They didn't hear him. Or maybe they couldn't. He saw Sarah Whitlock stumble, clutching a bundle to her chest, a blanket, maybe, or something living. John dragged her toward the team, shouting her name. Behind them, the sky boiled, black at its base and red above, churning like the end of all things. The wind shifted again, hard, sudden. The fire jumped the gully and came roaring down the slope. Elias didn't think. He ran. He reached the Whitlocks just as the first wave of heat hit not flame, but air so hot it stung his eyes and stole his breath. "You can't outrun it," he yelled. "Come with me." John turned, coughing, his face streaked with soot. "Where?" "Underground." Elias pointed toward the rise where his dugout lay, half hidden in smoke. "It'll hold." Sarah's eyes widened. She clutched his arm. "The children." "Go," Elias barked, grabbing her hand. "Now." They ran, bent low against the wind, the fire chasing their shadows. The sound was like 1,000. Cannons firing at once, the crack of timber, the hiss of sap exploding, the shriek of wind through flame. Elias could feel it on his back, the breath of something ancient and merciless. By the time they reached his mound, the world behind them was already burning. He shoved the Whitlocks inside first, sealing the door with his shoulder as he followed. The darkness swallowed them whole. Inside, the dugout pulsed with heat. Elias dropped the crossbar into place and pressed the hide curtain tight against the frame. Sarah was crying softly, the sound muffled by the roar outside. John crouched near the wall, clutching a bucket of water. "Air?" John rasped. "Small vent," Elias said, pointing upward. "It'll draw slow. Don't touch it." They waited. The sound outside grew louder, closer, a rolling thunder that shook the earth. The sod roof trembled under the weight of it. Dust sifted from the beams. Sarah buried her face in her hands. Elias moved to the center of the room and knelt, eyes closed. In his mind, he was back in the mountains a night near the Yellowstone when a grizzly had circled his camp. He had felt the same thing then, a silence inside the noise, a calm buried beneath terror. Survival was always the same. You didn't fight the wilderness. You let it pass over you, through you, until it moved on. "Stay low," he said quietly. "Breathe slow." Minutes became hours. The world outside was fury, a screaming inferno that tore across the land faster than a man could ride. The dugout shook with it, but the walls held. Elias could hear the sod above sizzling, water boiling from the wet clay he'd packed that morning. The heat pressed down, then lifted, then pressed again, like the pulse of some vast heart. Once there came a sound like thunder cracking open the sky. A nearby wagon, maybe the pitch melting, the wheels exploding. The ground shuddered. John cursed under his breath. Elias reached out and gripped his arm. "Hold fast," he said. "It'll pass." For a long while it didn't. Smoke forced its way through the vent in thin wisps, curling blue in the firelight of their single lantern. The air thickened, heavy and bitter. Elias tore a strip of cloth from his sleeve, soaked it, and handed it to Sarah. "Keep this over your mouth." The noise began to change. The roar softened, breaking into fits and gusts. The air grew cooler, then still. Outside, the great fire was moving on. Elias waited another hour before unbarring the door. When he pushed it open, a rush of cold air swept in, thick with ash. The night sky above was gray, the stars hidden behind smoke. The moon glowed faintly, pale and sick. They stepped out slowly. Sarah clutched John's arm. The land was gone black from one horizon to the other. The cabins were nothing but smoldering bones. The fences, the wagons, the forge, all erased. Only Elias's mound stood whole, a dark blister on a scorched plain. John sank to his knees. Sarah began to weep, the sound thin in the vast silence. Elias looked out over the land and said nothing. The prairie had claimed what was always its own. When the wind stirred again, it carried not heat this time, but the faint smell of wet clay, the scent of the earth cooling after judgment. He turned back to his doorway. The roof steamed gently, smoke rising in little wisps. His home had lived. "Come inside," he said quietly. "There's water and rest." The Whitlocks followed him down into the shelter they had once mocked. And there, beneath the ruined sky, the last fire of that terrible night flickered in the hearth of a man who had trusted the ground more than the wind. Outside, the world smoldered, but beneath it, life had endured. The dawn came slow, gray, and soundless, as though the sky itself was too weary to rise. The air was heavy with the sour tang of ash, the ground beneath still warm in places, whispering with the faint crackle of dying embers. All around, the world lay flattened and black. The grass was gone, the cabins erased, the fences reduced to faint scars of charcoal across the land. From the doorway of his dugout, Elias Carter stood watching. The smoke had lifted during the night, leaving the plains bare as bone. His eyes swept the horizon east to the Laramie Hills, west toward the blue smudge of the mountains. Nothing moved but the wind. It hummed through the ruins, soft and low, like a song for the dead. Behind him, Sarah and John Whitlock slept on the floor, wrapped in Elias's old buffalo robe. Their faces were streaked with soot, but they were alive. That was more than could be said for most. He moved quietly, stepping outside into the ash. Each footfall left a dark impression, soft and sinking. The air was cooler now, damp even the aftertaste of destruction. Overhead, a lone hawk circled, silent and slow. Down by the creek, what had once been Tom Kearney's forge was now a heap of twisted iron. The Tomtario anvil still stood, blackened but whole, like some monument to labor and loss. Nearby, Elias found the remains of the Whitlock's wagon, 2 iron wheels half melted into the ground. The smell of burned grain clung to the earth. He found no bodies. The fire had taken what it wanted and left nothing to bury. For a long time he just stood there, listening to the silence. The prairie had always been vast, but now it felt endless, not the living kind of endless that breathes with wind and grass, but the hollow kind that comes after everything has gone still. When he returned to the dugout, Sarah was awake. Her eyes were red but steady. "John's gone to look for the others," she said softly, "if there are any." Elias nodded. He poured her a cup of water from the clay jug and handed it to her. She drank slowly, staring out at the gray light beyond the door. "Everything's gone," she whispered. "All of it." "Not all," Elias said. She looked at him, not angry, just hollow. "Then what's left?" He gestured toward the earth around them. "This, the ground, it always starts over." She shook her head. "How can anyone start over in this?" Elias didn't answer right away. He sat near the doorway, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. "When the fur trade died," he said finally, "men said the same. They'd lived for the mountains, the rivers, the beaver. When that was gone, they thought the world was too. But it wasn't. It just changed its shape." Sarah turned the cup in her hands. "And you changed with it." Elias smiled faintly. "Didn't have much choice." For a while neither spoke. Outside the wind shifted, scattering ashes into the creek. The first small sounds of life returned: the faint chirp of a meadowlark, the whisper of water finding its way between stones. Even ruin, it seemed, could not keep the prairie quiet forever. By midday, John returned. His clothes were scorched, his hair singed, but he was unhurt. He'd found 2 more survivors, a pair of young brothers, who had hidden in a dry creek bed when the fire came. They followed him into Elias's dugout, eyes wide, faces ghost-pale. "Nothing left standing," John said, his voice low. "Not one cabin. Even the well collapsed from the heat." He looked at Elias. "If not for you, we'd all be gone." Elias shook his head. "You'd have done the same, given time." John gave a hollow laugh. "Time's a thing the fire didn't give us." They stayed in the dugout for 3 days, nursing their burns and drinking from the creek. The ash blew away slowly, revealing patches of blackened soil that steamed in the sun. On the 4th morning, a thin veil of green appeared, new grass, fragile as smoke, pushing through the ruin. Sarah saw it first. "Look," she whispered, kneeling at the door. "It's growing back." Elias joined her, his weathered face unreadable. "Told you," he murmured. "The ground always starts over." For the first time since the fire, she smiled. It was a small thing, but in that silence, it felt like a promise. That evening they buried what little they had salvaged: tools warped from heat, a half-melted horseshoe, a Bible scorched but still legible on a few pages. They marked the spot with a stone, not as a grave, but as a reminder. John carved the words into it with his knife. "Here we begin again." When the others slept, Elias went walking along the ridge. The prairie stretched beneath the moonlight, a patchwork of ash and new green. The wind carried the faint scent of life, returning wet earth, charred cedar, the sweetness of something unseen. He thought of all the places he had lived, the frozen passes of the Wind River, the Crow lodges on the Powder, the wild silence of the Yellowstone. Everywhere the same rule had held true: nothing stays, nothing dies forever. He looked back toward his mound of earth, its doorway glowing faintly from the firelight within. Once they'd mocked it. Now it was the only home left standing for miles. The wind rose again, soft and low, brushing the ash from his coat. He closed his eyes and let it pass over him. Somewhere out there the land was already healing, and for the first time in years Elias Carter felt something he hadn't known since the mountain's peace. Tomorrow he would help them rebuild. Not with walls of pride and timber, but with patience, with earth, the way the crow had taught him, the way the fire had reminded him. The prairie, he knew now, had not destroyed him. It had simply brought him back to what mattered: listening, enduring, and beginning again. He turned toward his home and walked down through the ash. Behind him, the wind whispered through the hollow plains, and the land, once more, began to breathe. By the time the first frost came, the prairie had begun to heal. It was a slow, stubborn kind of healing, one only the land understood. Here and there, tender shoots of green pierced the blackened soil. In the low draws where ash had gathered thick, willows sprouted from the roots that had not burned. The wind no longer smelled of smoke, but of cold, wet earth and something faintly sweet, the scent of rebirth. Elias Carter watched it all unfold from the rise above his dugout. The fire had taken the world apart, and now the world was quietly putting itself back together, one blade of grass at a time. He had seen men rebuild towns faster, but never with such grace. The settlers who had survived the fire stayed close that first season. There were too few of them now, only 5 souls in all: John and Sarah Whitlock, the 2 young brothers, and old Tom Kearney, who'd wandered back from the edge of the plains 2 weeks after the blaze, beard singed, eyes hollow. His forge was gone, but his hands still remembered their trade. Elias had taken them all in for a while. The dugout, meant for 1 man, now housed 6. They shared what food. He had traded silence for comfort. And when the nights grew too long, they spoke of what came next. It was John who finally said what they were all thinking. "We'll rebuild, not like before, not high and proud, but low, like yours, the way that kept you alive." Elias didn't argue. He just nodded once and handed him a shovel. By mid-September, the new homes began to take shape. Small half-dugouts built into the slope of the valley, framed with pine and packed with clay. They were nothing pretty, but they were strong, and they breathed with the earth instead of standing against it. Tom forged hinges and handles from scrap iron he found in the ash. Sarah lined the walls with hides to keep out the draft. When they lit their first hearth fires, the smoke rose clean and steady through vents Elias helped design. From a distance, the settlement looked almost invisible, a handful of mounds half buried in the earth. Travelers passing on the Oregon Trail that fall would have ridden right by without seeing them, and that was fine with Elias. The land didn't need more flags or fences. It needed patience. At night, when the others slept, Elias sat outside his mound and watched the stars return. For months after the fire, the sky had been veiled in smoke. Now it stretched clear and cold, filled with familiar constellations, the same ones he'd followed through the mountains years ago. They seemed closer now, sharper, as though the fire had burned away the distance between heaven and earth. Sometimes Sarah joined him. She would wrap herself in a blanket and sit quietly beside him, saying little. One night she asked, "Why do you think you were spared, Elias? You and this house of yours?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I wasn't spared," he said at last, "just ready." She studied him in the starlight. "You mean you knew it was coming?" "I didn't have to know," he said. "You live long enough out here, the land starts telling you things. You just have to listen. Most folks never learn how." Sarah smiled faintly. "Then maybe you should teach us." He glanced toward the dark humps of their new homes, smoke rising faintly from each. "I already have." The weeks turned into months. The ash blew away, and the prairie grew gold again. Buffalo returned in small herds, their hooves pressing new paths into the softened soil. The settlers planted winter wheat in the creek bed where the soil was richest. By Christmas, shoots of green pushed through the frost like defiance. One afternoon, Tom Kearney came trudging up the hill with a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a small iron plate, freshly hammered and stamped with words crudely etched by hand. "Thought you might like this," Tom said gruffly. "Something to mark what you'd done." Elias unfolded the cloth. The plate read, "Here stood the man who lived beneath the fire." He traced the letters with his fingers. "That ain't true," he said quietly. "I didn't live beneath it. I just let it pass over me." Tom shrugged. "Either way, you're the reason we're here." Elias set the plate into the ground at the foot of his mound. The words caught the last light of the day, glowing dull and orange like embers. "Ain't about reason," he murmured. "It's about listening." When spring came, the settlement was no longer just survival, it was home. The Whitlock's child, born that March, was the first cry of new life to echo across the valley since the fire. They named him Eli, though Elias pretended not to notice. In time, travelers did stop by. Wagon trains headed west, paused for water at the creek, and word spread of the small settlement that had survived the great prairie fire of the strange man who'd built beneath the earth and taught others to do the same. Some called him wise, others mad. He didn't much care for either. He kept to his ways, tending the land, mending roofs, watching the sky. When storms rolled in, he'd walk the ridge, feeling the air, reading the signs the wind left behind. And every time thunder rumbled or the horizon shimmered red with sunset, the settlers would glance toward his mound for comfort. Elias Carter never sought legend. But legends, as the frontier had proven, were rarely asked for. They simply took root where the land remembered a man's name. By the time the next fire season came, every home in the valley was built partly underground. And when the wind turned dry again and the smell of smoke drifted faintly from the north, none of them panicked. They sealed their doors, dampened their roofs, and waited it out calm as stones. The fire passed. The valley lived. On a warm evening after that, Elias sat alone on the ridge. The grass waved gold beneath the sun, and the earth below felt solid, breathing, eternal. He smiled, not proud, not triumphant, but quiet, like a man who had finally made peace with both the land and his own solitude. He had not conquered the wilderness, he had listened to it. And in listening, he had learned the oldest truth there was, that sometimes survival isn't found by standing tall, but by learning how to live close to the earth. He tipped his hat to the horizon, the firelight of dusk glowing red across the plains. "Thank you," he whispered. Though whether he spoke to the land, the wind, or God himself, no one would ever know.